Thanks. Okay. All right. Okay, so today we'll hopefully clear up. If you have any questions, of course you should, like I said, you should have lots. We're just getting into this stuff and there's a lot to get a handle on at first. So yeah, like I said, feedback on levels of analysis exercise. I sent the announcement last week while it was fresh in everybody's heads, including my own, because now it's been a week later and, you know, who remembers what happened last week? But apparently this happened. Oh, summarizing the events. I forgot to tell you all that, so don't worry about it if you didn't. You didn't need to summarize the events for me. I know what happened. Just tell me like what parts of those events. So that's fine. It probably won't apply to the in-class essay, but because it might. So if there is a thing, if it's a similar thing where it's analyze this event for, you know, from the three different perspectives, from the three theoretical perspectives, not the levels, but analyze this event. What would a realist say about it? Liberalist or constructivist say about this particular event? I don't know that that's what it's going to be yet, but if it is, you don't have to summarize the events. You don't even have to write an intro paragraph, but if you do, the introduction should only do one thing, and that's tell me what your answer to the prompt is. A short version, you know. So like I said, this was my example of like if you write an intro, sit straight up. I know it's like really obvious, but yeah, that's all it was for this particular assignment. You know, first level looks at individuals, second level looks at the state. Third level of analysis would look at the characteristics of the international system as a whole. That would just be like my intro paragraph, and then each paragraph below that should support, you know, offer supporting evidence for more details, you know. So you could have 3 paragraphs below that. You totally don't need a conclusion. For longer things, if you're writing something long and you have a kind of complicated argument, your conclusion should say the same thing as the intro. It should just kind of sum up, this is what I said. Just like when you're public speaking, tell them what you're going to tell them and then tell them it, and then tell them what you told them, you know, 3 times, that kind of thing. So that's the basic framework I'm looking for. It makes for a really successful in-class essay. And now I'll hand out maybe those little paragraph things that I had. Maybe we'll see. I know it's kind of elementary, but it's to be reminded. Almost everybody got first level, right? Because that's the most intuitive. That makes sense. Good answers, you know, just mentioned to the individuals who were involved. Oh, it's interesting to note that the first level, it doesn't have to be, you know, state leaders. It could be the guy who didn't okay the launch on the submarine, for example. It could just be like the guy who set himself on fire in Tunisia and started the Arab Spring. But it doesn't have to be a state leader. It could just be a person who was in the right place at the right time. Something about what they did or said just resonated, and it sparks that particular event. So, you know, and also, yeah, ask yourself if another leader had been in place. Like, for example, Kennedy was, you know, known for being very reserved and cool-headed. What if Trump had been the president during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Like, how would that change things? So, so that's one way to think about, like, how does that analysis work? If you switch it out for another thing of that level, how would it change? You know, so second level, I guess, is the one that most people what you did was say what the state did is an example of second level. But remember that that's what we're trying to explain. That's the dependent variable I was talking about last week. Why did the state do those things? So an example of the second level is just always to look at the characteristics of a particular state to explain why it did those things. You know, did it do that because it's a democracy? Did it do that because it's a monarchy? Did it do that because it's a communist state or a capitalist state, or you know, something about that particular state? Something that's like, yeah, does that make sense? We'll see more of it. The reason why we say this is associated with the liberalist analysis is because democratic peace theory is all about how democracies are more peaceful than autocracies, so not to go to war with other democracies. And the reason they do that, because they are democracies, that particular characteristic of a state. If they were a different kind of state, then that wouldn't apply. So you see how that's a state level. We're going to talk more about liberalism and not this week, not next week as an example of realism, the week after. So it will be like, what is that, 7? We're week 5 now. Yeah, so it'd be week 7. Like I said, I threw that question out in the quiz. Democratic peace theory is example, second level. And then third level, yeah, there's only one system that matters at the third level, and that's, the power hierarchy of nation states at the time. So I know some people mentioned like communism and capitalism and all their systems. Yeah, they're systems, but they're not the system that we're talking about here in this case. In this case, we're really just concerned about the power of the individual states. So which are the most powerful states in the system at the time? And how does that affect? So we're going to see examples of that later on in this lecture. We'll see the theory of hegemonic war, or talk about that. So that will become more clear this week and also next. Yeah, and just a reminder about the dependent variable is the thing that we are trying to explain. So that's a good intro to this lecture on introducing the first 3 theories, because the first 3 theories, realism, liberalism, and constructivism, they're all trying to explain the same thing. They all have the same dependent variable. You want a fancy word, it's called the explanandum, the thing we were trying to explain. And the independent, those are called explanans, the things that do the explaining, right? So the difference between those 3 theories, these first 3 theories, is that they just all have different explanans to explain the same explanandum. Just think independent variable and dependent variable. The independent variables, the dependent variable depend on the independent variable. But they all have the same thing that we're trying to explain, which is why does stuff happen in the international level? Why did this war happen? Why did the economic crisis of 2008, why did that happen? Something about international politics that we're trying to explain. Why did this state do that and that state do this? All of it, same question. The first 3 theories all have different answers to why that happened. And they also use different levels of analysis too. So you see how this will start making more sense, right? Any questions so far about independent variables and dependent variables? About the deductive nomological method, this particular method of science. Take a philosophy of science course to get you to learn fun facts like that. So okay, here's the example. Dependent variable, what causes war? That's essentially like the research question for all of international relations, or at least it was. It's no longer, but that's the one we kind of started with in the early 20th century. The realism's answer is what causes war? Power differentials between states. And by power, when a realist mentions power, they only mean what we call material power, which is either military power or economic power. And that's just opposed to like the power of ideas, ideational power. So a realist, actually a particular kind of realist, I think we mentioned this last time too. 2 different kinds of realist. One works on the first level, classical realist. It's all about the qualities of a particular leader. So Machiavelli was giving advice to the princes on how to become good leaders, how to stay in power. It's all about, the characteristics of the individual leader. Neo-realism or structural realism works on the 3rd level, and this is really a structural realist. The question is, it all depends on the balance. How much power can the state get? They say you want to get as much power as possible. So liberalism's answer to the same question for a lack of democracy, right? Democratic peace theory comes from Kant. I already said that. You want peace, build democracy. 2 things help keep peace for liberals. This will become more important week 7. But for now, 2 things that were mentioned in the chapter. Sorry about them. I was going to ask you. But what were those 2 things? This one, you should know this like back and forth by the end of this week. Yeah. Yeah, those 2 things. Always, whenever you hear, anything about liberalism, always think economic ties, trade, like what you were talking about last week, right? Something about economic ties, and then I started talking about Norman Angel. Interdependence, yeah. And then international organizations. So liberals say those 2 things are what keep peace or what prevent war. You have a lot of economic ties with other states, it's financially not a good idea for either state to go to war with each other because it'll hurt them financially. Right? That's and then they also have international organizations. So, and then the constructivists will say, well, their answer to this question, what causes war, is, well, it's ideas and this thing they call strategic culture. That's just how we think about who is our enemy and who is our friend. It's like the ideas in our heads, basically. So you see how they're all answering the same question, but they have different explanants. So these are the explanants, basically, the things that explain the explanandum. So I guess I can anticipate a question. If this is first level and third level, and this is second level, what is constructivism? First level, guys? No, that's fine. You're like, not sure. There's good arguments for, I don't know. It's like, it's not super, first level makes sense. Because we're our ideas in the heads of individuals. But individuals also, yeah, Graham.
Maybe like 1.5, because it's the bridge between the two theories, I guess.
They live in a group, individuals live in a group, they live in societies, so maybe
Yeah.
level.
Yeah, it kind of looks at both of the theories,
Yeah.
I guess.
No, that's what I was gonna add, because they combined. Still would think it also a group,
Yeah,
maybe.
I think you could make a good argument for that as well. So constructivism, it's this kind of, you could even make an argument for it on the second level. I have a professor that's kind of big. Well, because I have this old professor who was writing, it's not so much about the democratic piece. It's not so much that they're democracies, it's that they're culturally similar to each other. So, I don't know, it's not hard. These are very clear. Realism, definitely first level and third level, systems level, individual level. Liberalism, definitely state level. Constructivism, you can make an argument, I guess, on all of them. Depending, you just have to, if you were explaining this on the quiz, you would just have to, say, why do you think it's individual level or group level or whatever. Brandon, sorry, I would do that all semester.
So you said with realism, it's first level and third level. I understand the third level part, but why first level?
Why first level? Think about Machiavelli. This is my classic example, because he's giving advice to princes. It's all about the leadership qualities of that individual. So if you have a smart enough leader, they can, or depending on the temperament of the leader, that could determine whether or not that state goes to war. It's all about who's the leader. In some case, and like a lot of y'all made in the point in your discussion post, is that it's not like one of these levels works. Like they all kind of work together, right? Obviously, it makes sense always that the characteristics of the individual leader of a state probably has some influence in almost all cases, right? But there's other factors at play too. And like a structural realist or a neo-realist, like that guy John Mearsheimer that was in the video, he would say, yeah, but this other stuff matters most. What really matters is the balance of power in the system. That make sense? Okay, fun stuff. I like it. Hopefully y'all are liking it more or less. Yeah, okay.
So first level realism is kind of the differences in military and economic power. Is that first level?
Looking at characteristics of individuals,
Oh, okay.
leaders,
Okay.
yeah.
It's the same for realists. Like first level is still going to be individual, right?
Yes.
Okay.
First level is always individuals. Although here's a bit of a nuance. Realism and liberalism, we say these are both statist approaches. And they both focus on the nation state as the center of that's their unit of analysis, as opposed to something else such as international organizations or non-governmental actors, stuff like that.
Right. But the classical realist, which is the second level.
No, classical realist is first level.
Okay, that's first level. Okay, that's what I got mixed up on. Okay.
Yeah. So we'll hit this over and over again for the next 2 weeks. So it'll just become like embedded in your mind. You'll be sick of it by the end here. So yeah, both realists and liberals, they're always statists in the sense that they're looking into like nation states is what they're looking at, as opposed to other things. Constructivists are always hard to categorize. It depends on what they're doing. Some constructivists, they're focused on nation states as well. Others are not. So they're just all over the map. Yeah, and like I said, we'll say later on in this lecture, it's kind of limited in liberalism because they have organizations as well. And realist, it's not that they say that they don't disagree with that. They say international organizations are fine and important, but they're not the most important thing. So it's a matter of emphasis, really. Right? Like it's just what do they think is most important? But yeah, comparing realist to a liberalist, a realist is definitely more focused on the state and its survival in an anarchic system. That's what they say. It's all about that. Everything else, like those things are there. You know, the characteristics of the individual leader, they matter a bit. Maybe international organizations matter a bit, but really, when it comes down to it, what the realist says, what matters is how much power your state has, whether it can survive. That's it, because there is no international 911. There's nobody you can call to come help if your neighbor invades you. You have to amass as much power as possible in order to not get invaded. And everything else is secondary to that. It doesn't matter what type of state you have, whether it's democracy or capitalist system or anything. It all comes down to that first. It's just a matter of emphasis. So all of these things are, yeah, mostly a matter of emphasis. So they don't necessarily totally disagree. They just have a different, they say what matters more. Any questions so far? This is sort of making sense, right? Makes more sense with like last week, now that we had that thing that was like very abstract levels of analysis. Why are we doing this? Hopefully it's making more sense why we did that. Realism, I want to give you an example of realism. This was in previous class, the first time I have not assigned this article. So I don't know, are y'all lucky or unlucky? You did not have to read Robert Gilpin's Theory of Hegemonic War. If you're a poli-sci major, I highly recommend it because you're going to have to read it at some point. It's not a difficult article. When I've used it before, students liked it. It was pretty straightforward. It wasn't very jargony. So it's just long. It's an academic length article. This is the guy's like great grandfatherly. What's that word? Avuncular. It's very vocab word. SAT vocab word. Avuncular guy. So I try to find a picture of every time I talk about a particular theorist. I try to find a picture of them so you can see who these people are and also see certain biases in the field. So this guy, Robert Gilpin, writes this book that comes out. It's called War and Change, but basically what he's known for is this theory of hegemonic war. So a hegemon, I should have just asked you, I should have the definition on here, but how many of you are familiar with that term? You know what a hegemon is? Most people do. Okay, good. So yeah, it's just the hegemon is just the strongest state in the system. That's it. They kind of have a monopoly on power. So and it said, what do hegemons want? Of course, if you're the top dog in the system, what is the thing that you most want? Yeah, Anthony.
Security.
Security, stability. You don't want the system to change because you're at the top of it. So you're like, no, things are good. Let's keep things the way they are. They're good. So stability is the #1 goal. And how do hegemons rule? By creating institutions, which we define institutions as systems of rules and norms, regulations. Another word for this is world orders. So world orders is a term that, if you Google it, like I Googled this to find some video or something, the first thing that comes up is a conspiracy theory about the new world order. And it's a proposed like, oh, there's this secret world government, this like, the secret cabinet of people, and they control everything that happens in the entire world. You know this? That's not what world order means when we're talking in international relations. Obviously, that is not what we mean. What we mean when we say a world order is just the system of institutions and organizations, rules and norms that are set up generally by the hegemon because it's the most influential state. So, and we mostly talk about the liberal world order now because that's the one we're living in, unless it's ended. That's debatable. So we'll talk about that during week 7, the liberal world order. What we mean by that is just the set of institutions that the US and the other victors of World War II set up in the wake of that war. And those institutions still define the world order today. So we generally say it's a liberal world order. Maybe it's ending, maybe there's change. We'll see. We'll talk about that. But does that make sense? You've heard the term liberal world order before. It doesn't mean ruled by Democrats. So that's another thing that's kind of confusing. I think I mentioned that before, that word liberal being associated in the US with the Democratic Party. But actually we'll find out conservatives up until recently, the MAGA Republicans excluding them, but otherwise generally Republicans and Democrats were both liberals. They both come from that liberal tradition. We'll learn more about that next week. But yeah, so let me say, you know, it's just power politics. That's what creates the world order. The victors of the Second World War were the ones that set up all the rules and institutions. So they've created the liberal world order. I wanted to give you, I left this up from last semester because we read the article, this theory of hegemonic war, and then one of the assignments was identify the propositions of the article. So you don't have to do that. I'm just telling you, here's the propositions. The reason why I'm pointing this out is because we talked about this before, right? How every argument has propositions. Propositions are just statements or claims made. So there's 3 of them. This is how it works. This is a good guide to just how academic arguments work in general. Or anytime you're reading any academic article, there's going to be propositions. And they'll sometimes tell you that straight up. These are my propositions. So there's 3 in his argument. It says a hegemonic war is distinct from other categories of war. Not all wars are hegemonic. In fact, most wars are not hegemonic. That's one thing. That's the first claim that he makes. Hegemonic wars are different from other kinds of wars. The second claim that he makes is really a basic one. So sometimes propositions can be very, very basic. We've already encountered the second one. He just says the relationships among individual states can be thought of as a system. That's it. That's the basically systems level analysis. It's just 3rd level analysis, right? And spoiler alert, the theory of hegemonic war is indeed a 3rd level analysis theory. And then his 3rd proposition is that a hegemonic war threatens and transforms and changes that system. So that's his definition of a hegemonic war. So based on all these 3 things, he says, you know, hegemonic war involves all or most of the states in the system. Most wars are not hegemonic wars. Like I think I said last time, if there's 2 small states that have a war, it's obviously not a hegemonic war. It's not going to change the system. But I think we also mentioned this, if there's for today, if the US went to war with China, would that be a hegemonic war?
Yes.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, because those are the 2 most powerful states in the system. So a hegemonic war is something that changes the entire system. So his proposition is that, you know, hegemonic war is different, that there is such a thing as a system, and that a hegemonic war changes that system. That's all it is. So if you wanted to disagree with this argument, all you need to do is like disagree with one of these propositions. But like I said, you know, I say that because students often want to disagree. And that's fine. But there's the other side of it is that, you know, these theorists are pretty smart, or else we wouldn't be teaching them to you. And you would kind of want to keep an open mind and think about like, well, if this was true, can I hear what can I follow their argument? You know? If I did agree with that, I might not agree with that. You don't have to decide forever. Most people do though. Did you know that? Like most people, what you're deciding now in your 20s, it's gonna be the same thing when you're 45. Ah, that's so annoying. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't solidify yourself. You like cement yourself in forever. But most people will do. The decisions and the opinions that they form in their early 20s, they never ever revisit them ever. No matter what happens in the world. I've had this conversation with so many friends because now, you know, we're older. So I'm like, I knew you when you were 22. You had that same opinion. The world has freaking changed a lot since then. Think you can reconsider it maybe? Like maybe you want to do, I don't know, but that's apparently a very normal thing. So think about whether you're cementing your opinions in right now. Maybe you don't want to do that. So this, I guess I already just said, yeah, to see how this is a third systems level of analysis. Sometimes I have more slides than I need. Example, I think I've already made this point too, so I think I should have time for constructivism. Here's the example of Sparta fighting Athens during the Peloponnesian War. And he says, you know, initially you have a relatively stable system. The hegemon is Sparta. They're the ruling power in the system being just the Mediterranean at that point. Athens is a growing power though. You have, over time, you have a subordinate state gaining power, begins to grow. And then that rising state comes into conflict with the hegemon. So that's the characteristic of that system that is causing that war. The war wasn't caused because Athens was a democracy and Sparta was not. But this goes back to Thucydides. So Thucydides is the one who came up, he wrote his history of Peloponnesian War. And you know what he wrote essentially was this early level. Gilpin just looked at that and said, oh, I know what that is. That's systems level. We should just call that a thing. So Thucydides didn't call it a thing. Gilpin called it a thing. That's a thing. So yeah, whenever you have this struggle with the hegemon with another state, it's going to transform the system. Anthony.
Would you consider events like the World Wars or the Napoleonic Wars to be hegemonic wars or no?
Yes, yes. In fact, he has those listed in his article where he gives examples. So yeah, any poli-sci majors, I definitely really recommend read Gilpin's article because it's pretty straightforward and it's easy and it's interesting. Even Thucydides' book, History of the Peloponnesian War, is really fun read if you like action novels. It reads like an action novel. You know, these people go over here, like they decide, somebody decides, I forget who it is, but it's Athens. They decide to go kill all the people on this island here. And then they send off the ships to do that, and then they change their minds. And they're like, oh no, we should have thought about that more. Let's send off another ship, try to catch that first ship. Stuff like that happens. It's really fascinating. So yeah, if you ever have to read Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, don't worry, it's not a dry read at all. It's very interesting. But yeah, he's known. That's why we say realism dates back to ancient Greeks because of this guy. One of the, not the first historian, but one of the first historians. Thucydides. Make sense? Doing great on time. So. Yeah, Anthony.
In the future, if there was like hypothetically speaking, like in the next 5 years, we would have a war with a state like Iran. That would not be hegemonic, right? It's like I don't think.
Yeah, because Iran's not powerful enough. They're a powerful state, but they're not anywhere near like China and the US. They're not yeah. They got a lot more powerful.
We can consider like a proxy war hegemonic because two powerful states are involved in some way, even though they're not in contact with each
Well, yeah, I guess you can make that argument, like during the Cold War,
other.
for
Right.
example. Possibly, but really, like, just forget about the proxies. It's the conflict between the US and the USSR that's what matters.
Definitely hegemonic conflict. I don't know about all out.
Yeah.
I don't think it could be a hegemonic war because if one country were to like completely win or something like that, it wouldn't dramatically change like global powers.
Right, the proxy war wouldn't, right? Yeah, that's a
I
good.
mean, it did change world order though, because it went from bipolar to unipolar.
Oh, like
and-
when the USSR collapsed.
Yeah. Once it officially ended, it did transform a lot of state relations.
That's true. So could we say, and that wasn't even a war. That was just the USSR collapse. The one of the poles is no more. And there's a transformation of the global system. So. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I don't think it's the war that did it. Like, I think the war was part of it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why I wouldn't be.
Lots of internal stuff that was going on too, like mismanagement, economic mismanagement. And also ideas. That's I use that example, Cold War, as an example of constructivism. So I'll just give you a little bit of a preview of it because we'll talk about it more like week 8. But we'll come back to that. Let me come back to that when I get onto like a brief overview of the other ones. Okay, so remember this slide from last week. The second level of analysis emphasizes the characteristics of the individual states. And we talked about democratic peace theory. It comes from Kant. And it has its roots in the Enlightenment. So that's why when we're saying it's liberalist, we're talking about liberalism as it goes back to the Enlightenment. Examples, England's Glorious Revolution of 1688, the American Revolution of 1776, all of these, the French Revolution of 1798, all of these things were of course, they were fought on liberal principles. Meaning they were inspired by the ideas of Locke. So remember how I told you about Thomas Hobbes? I don't want to get too much into the theory for this class, but Thomas Hobbes, who was living in that period of the English Civil Wars where there was no state, and one king gets his head chopped off, the other one has to flee the country. There's no government whatsoever. It's just complete anarchy. And he says, in this context, it makes sense rationally for any rational human being to give all of the sovereignty to one all-powerful ruler. So he justifies rule, absolute rule. He says all of the sovereignty has no limits. He justifies absolute rule based not on divine right, but on rationality. He's like, that is more rational than living in this chaos. So you have to think about what the context that he was living in at the time that made him think such a thing. Because it's hard for us now, really that was, we weren't living in the English Civil Wars like he was. So it made sense to him. And then Locke came along and said, okay, well, I'll see you on that. I take that argument, but I'm going to add some arguments. And Locke says, I'm going to add that there should be some limits on that power that I'm given. Okay, I'll grant you that. It makes sense for people to surrender some sovereignty, some freedom, to do anything they want. They're going to cut off your neighbor's head as they sleep. In exchange for the security I get from the state. Locke says, well, there should be some limits on the state. The state shouldn't even do anything. Individuals have some inherent human rights. And that was starting to sound like the Declaration of Independence. Right. So you can see how those were based in these ideas. Rousseau comes along and says, he says a lot of stuff about the noble savage and everything, but he's more about all of these people are kind of adding more caveats and stuff onto Hobbes's idea, just kind of making it more refined. So yeah, does that make sense then for? And we'll talk about this more, like I said, week 7. So I've just borrowed some of these slides from week 7. Main ideas of liberalism. Same stuff you've probably heard about since high school. Opposition to monarchy is the #1 thing. Separation of powers. Who was it that somebody made a really interesting point? They said something was the separation of powers. Oh, Keisha, was it yours? You were talking about the separation of we were talking about the Treaty of Westphalia. I think you said something it's similar to separation of powers of the state. Maybe it was Dustin. Somebody said something in their discussion post that was really interesting. I was like, yeah, that makes sense. The separation of powers, that makes sense. It's kind of a thing that one does to ensure it's a hedge against an all-powerful monarchy thing. It's a hedge against too much power being concentrated in one place. I can't remember who, sorry. If you think of it, if this is ringing a bell. No, don't forget your own discussion post. That's fine. And don't blame me, I can't keep them all straight either. Okay, so basically, yeah, liberty and individual rights are important, equality is important, and then free market capitalism. All of those are ideas that get traced back to the Enlightenment period. And so when we say liberalism in IR, we mean that set of ideas. We don't mean the Democratic Party in the US. That makes sense, right? We have time, yeah. So leaving quickly, we're here. So yeah, one of the things I'll ask you, they could be a thing for the in-class essay is how do these different theoretical approaches think about something like security. Is that your first instinct might be like, oh, well, realists are the only ones concerned about security, but no, liberals are too. They just go about it in a different manner. So they think, security is best achieved by these things we just said. People also tend to think that realists are, I don't know, this makes no sense, but some people, so in classes before, people have thought realists are like kind of warmongers. Liberals are pacifists? No, definitely not. We'll see with this article that we're going to read for Wednesday's small group activity. Definitely not, but kind of the reverse.
It is,
Yeah.
it's
So,
really, they're more pessimistic.
and they're saying,
They're more optimistic.
they're more pessimistic, and they're also say that you shouldn't get involved, especially like looking at the US recently, like when the US invaded Iraq, all the realists were like, no, you shouldn't do that. They were all against it. So, but that doesn't mean that they're isolationists either. It just means that their realists are like, you don't want to fight a war that you don't need to. Like it's,
Necessarily.
yeah, so don't fall into that temptation of wanting to put them into these categories because it doesn't work. Graham.
Wasn't there a separate category for defensive realists? Believe that aggression will cause war in certain situations?
Yes, yeah. So some realists, yeah, they would say like offensive realists and defensive realists. Offensive realists are like a state should just amass as much power as it can. But defensive realists are like, no, if you do that, you're going to make your neighbor nervous. And then that's going to cause war. Right, yeah. Anthony.
Yeah, I was gonna say that like with the casus belli for the whole Iraq war happening was Bush saying that like, oh, there's nukes in Iraq and they're gonna make nukes and they're gonna like launch it at another country and we need to invade Iraq and take those nukes out before they use it. Isn't that the whole like reason why it happened?
Yeah, that was the claim made at the time. As we'll see in this article, let me go ahead and pass them out. I have hard copies. Because I want you to make notes and highlights on this thing and bring it back with you. So put it in your, whatever your folder is for this class and bring it back on Wednesday. Sorry, I know I didn't do enough because it's, they'll come around. This article is old. It's 20 years old now. And keep using it. I was just thinking, should I finally stop using this article? No, I like it. I like it because it is 20 years old. And what it is, it's from Foreign Policy Magazine. It's not an academic article. It's an article for the general public and it's about the main theories.
Was there any extra one?
Yeah, they're coming around.
Okay.
I just gave too much on this side. But yeah, back then, 20 years ago, constructivism was still relatively new. So in this article, it's called idealism. This doesn't really fit. But that was because, when you have these theories, there's no consensus at first. What are we going to call it? We could be calling it structuration theory. If you went with one of the founders of that's what he first called it, structuration. But eventually it became known as constructivism. Much better term. But yeah, you can see in this article, which was written 20 years ago, right around the time the US invaded Iraq in 2003, it was liberal policies that justified the war and that justified that intervention. So you can kind of see that back then. If you're just looking at right now, maybe it would be harder to see, well, how would liberalism justify wars? Like, isn't it kind of pacifist? But no, not necessarily. 'Cause, yeah.
Would you say like the US invasion of Cuba and Vietnam, would that be an example of liberal interventionism?
Okay, so say Vietnam, part of like one of those proxy wars for the Cold War. How would you, well, that would be good. Like think of each of these theoretical approaches would have a different response to that. They would all explain it in a different way.
My thought was like, they wanted to spread democracy.
Right?
Because it would not only be best for US interests, but it would also be best for the interests of the people in that region.
Exactly. That's what they say in this article from 40 years ago. The same thing for, right, yeah, whether that's true or not. Ryder and then Jaden.
It's off topic, but the packet never made it over. So
Oh, the article.
Yeah.
Extras. I might not have made enough. Anybody who volunteers, like, I'll bring extras, so, because I want you to have a hard copy. Is that what you were asking, or you had a different point?
I had a different point. I was gonna build off of, Dustin's point.
Dustin.
Dustin's point, thank you. I actually would say that there were very realist reasons to, be in, say, Vietnam and, Cuba especially. Because in the case of Vietnam, it was part of the policy of containment that the United States had with the USSR, and it was because the USSR had a fundamental ideological reason to spread communism, and the idea of containment was that it was basically to get the world together to contain communism, because if it wasn't contained where it was, it would spread out and and there'd be so many communist countries, they would all align with each other and threaten the security of the United States.
Right, that's exactly what realists would say back then. Realism really defined US foreign policy after after World War II, up until, let me think, up until, I'm not sure, it depends on. But yeah, definitely Kissinger, because somebody asked me the first week of class, like, are we gonna talk about Henry Kissinger in this class? And I said, well, we're gonna talk about realists. So yeah, we don't read anything about Kissinger specifically, but yeah, he's an example of a realist. So yeah, so all of these, they would all, there's enough, it's really hard to say there's one war that's definitely only liberalism explains it or only realism explains it. Just that each theoretical approach would explain it differently depending on what they're looking at, depending on their levels of analysis too. So it depends on what they're looking at that determines like how they go about explaining that event. Any questions before we go on to constructivism, and then that will be it. That was great. That is really, it gets murky. There's no clear dividing lines. It's like you can make an argument for anything. If you can make a good argument for it, I'll buy it. You gotta back it up with, like evidence. You can argue anything you want, but cite stuff and back it up. I mean, like in your essays. Okay, so here's how constructivism came about. In 1991, we've talked about this many times, the USSR collapsed, and that was the end of the Cold War, essentially. The world became unipolar just because the US was the only one standing at that point. China was still a long ways from being the superpower that it is now. Russia was just, had this whole lost decade. Japan was going through a lost decade economically as well. There just was no, it was definitely like a unipolar situation. But when the Berlin Wall fell, realists and liberals both, but especially realists, had a hard time explaining it. Nobody predicted it. And like, oh, Ricardo, he didn't make our class, but the person who was sitting here was asked about that. He asked about like, oh, shouldn't theories predict? And I'm the one that's skeptical. There are some who say, like Mearsheimer in that video, he mentioned like a good theory should make predictions. I'm the one that's in the camp that's skeptical that theories and IR can make predictions, but nobody predicted the end of the Cold War. So in international relations, everybody thought, well, what's wrong with our theories that we didn't see this coming? Yeah.
What are you saying? Because no one thought of a theory.
No, none of the theories could explain it. Like realism, the war didn't end because the more militarily powerful state won. Liberalism, the war didn't end because some international organization or economic interconnectedness made it end. That's not why it ended. So those theories had no answer to why that major international event happened.
And this is.
And constructivism comes along and says, how about this? Cold War ended because ideas changed. People just no longer believed in the communist state at that point. Democracy was really popular. The US had a lot of soft power at that time. Coca-Cola and jeans and anything about the US was really popular in Europe. Democracy as a form of government was really popular. So there was a lot of appeal around those ideas. And so constructivists came along and said, okay, the Cold War ended because norms and ideas changed. And that's why, that explains it. So, yeah, so you can see how like all these theories, they're all trying to explain why a big event happened. If they can't explain it, then yeah, you might have another theory pop up and say, okay, now we have a new theory. So, yeah.
Can you kind of explain what's the difference between this and earlier idealism? Like,
Good question, good question. I think that is
this is
really
more
confusing.
modern.
In this article, he's gonna call constructivism idealism. Idealism now, it's just I just think of early 20th century idealism, the specific, you know, the progressive party in the US, Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points, the idea of like, oh, we can have a League of Nations that will stop war. And they really thought that wars were like archaic and outdated. They wouldn't happen anymore because humans had progressed and far enough along with technology and everything else that it was just not going to be a thing anymore. That's what I think of. And I think most people think of now when you say idealism. The reason why this guy calls constructivism idealism is because he's taken that word, the root word idea. He's saying that they're focused on ideas. Oh, and also because he was also saying they were focused, constructivists at that time, were really focused on human rights. And so he saw it as just like that kind of idealism.
Idea.
But constructivists now, like some are focused on human rights, but it's definitely not a defining thing for constructivism. But yeah, constructivism, just that, you know, the idea that social life is made up of ideas and that politics is part of the social world. So, and of course, because of this, you have rules of identity matters a lot. Who I identify as impacts the decisions that I make. Who I see as an enemy impacts the decisions that I make. So for constructivism, a state's identity matters a lot. And who it sees as like itself or not like itself impacts who it sees as an enemy. So that's the 500 nukes idea, like 500 nukes in Canada versus 500 nukes in North Korea. Everyone else would say 500 nukes is 500 nukes, doesn't matter. But constructivist says, no, what matters is our ideas about the identities of those countries. Canada is not an enemy. North Korea is. So those that's how our idea is. It makes sense. Right? It's interesting. And you can kind of see how it fills in some of the gaps of realism and liberalism too. Because realism and liberalism, like all of these theories, they're all really great. There's really great examples of them. Like when I'm reading them, I'm all like, when I was first in grad school for the first time encountering them, I'd be like, the first one I read, like, oh, I'm a realist. You know, because it's so convincing. Like, yeah, how could I disagree with that? And then the next week, liberalism, and now I'm a liberalist. And then the third week, I'm a constructivist. But you know, it just goes on like that. But that's actually a good thing. You know, try on each of these theories. You don't have to commit to them for the rest of your life. In fact, you shouldn't commit to them for the rest of your life. And like I said last time, there's that people don't really identify so much with one particular theoretical tradition anymore like they used to. And it's just for the same reason people don't want to put themselves into boxes. So yeah, but in like somebody might ask in previous classes, somebody asked, well, in our department, in the poli-sci department, how many realists are there and how many liberalists and constructivists? All I know is I can say there's at least two realists. There's at least one critical theorist, and they would identify as such as well. But other people, like I don't necessarily know in our department where their work falls because they just don't emphasize that as an identity as much that I'm this or that or the other. But yeah, I don't know. That's it pretty much. That was my intro. This is this is the last slide on this. But and the books talks about this, the different ideas about anarchy, like how anarchy is a thing. Like there is no world government. States exist in an anarchical environment, but then this guy Alexander Blunt came along and he said, well, anarchy is what states make of it. It depends on their ideas. There's different types of anarchy. So another example. So if you haven't read that, go back and read that. On Wednesday, we were doing this other small group activity. So, and we'll use this article to read this One World article. Anybody who, I'll have extra copies. I'm sorry, I didn't have enough for everybody today, but Definitely take notes and highlight.
It's on JSTOR, so you can find it.
It's in the modules.
Find it online.
It is,
Great.
I read it.
The modules, yeah. Oh, you already read it, yeah, okay, yeah, so there you go, so that's what, we'll use that for our small group activity on Wednesday. That's it.